Okay, I think we'll get started now. Good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Fife. I am the general counsel here at LIBOR, and I want to welcome everybody to LIBOR's second Wednesday webinar for the month of November. Every week this month, we're going to explore legal issues that impact your day-to-day practice of real estate. I think this was timely. This was actually planned well before the Class Action Commission lawsuit verdict last week in Missouri. It had been our plan months ago to have November focus on some of these issues. But the lawsuit to me is proof that you all need to understand the law, know your obligations, and be prepared to adapt in the event of change. And I think these webinars are a great resource for you to stay updated on the industry and the law. So please let everybody in your office know if they're not here today to check them out. They are being recorded. This one's being recorded, last week's, next week's, everyone is being recorded. And before I introduce Neil, I just want to say I know there's a lot of information out there on different topics, agency, compensation, and other legal issues, the NAR lawsuits. And, anybody with a smartphone and a microphone can make themselves look like an expert. So it may be difficult for you to know who to trust. But I can tell you the constant resource that you can trust is LIBOR. We are always looking out for your best interests. We're always going to give you the guidance and information that will help you grow your business legally and ethically. And I think today's topic is going to do that for you when it comes to the subjects of agency disclosure, dual agency. And these are concepts you absolutely need to know. You need to understand. You need to be able to explain to your clients. And I can think of no better person to cover that issue for us today than Neil Garfinkel. Neil, quick intro, is the managing partner of Abrams, Garfinkel, Margolis, Bergson, LLP, which is a 28-year-old law firm with offices in New York, California, and Long Island. He is a practicing real estate and banking attorney. He specializes in representing the real estate brokerage industry. He is broker counsel to the Real Estate Board of New York, which is also known as REBNY. For the first 12 years of his career, he worked very closely with us here at LIBOR. And he continues to do so today. He teaches fair housing and legal updates for us every month here at LIBOR. So if you like what you hear from him and you think he's a great instructor, and I think you will, please go and sign up for his courses. So with that, I want to welcome Neil and ask him to get started and give us his dual agency deep dive.
Great.
So thank you for being here, Neil. We appreciate it. And if anybody has questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A. Neil and I will be looking at it and trying to answer any questions that come up. So thank you and welcome, Neil.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, and congratulations on your new role. I'm looking forward to working with you, just as I've worked with LIBOR for, as you said, close to 29 years at this point. So I'm going to jump right in. We have a lot to cover today. I love to tell this story, though. I love to tell the story of how I started. I worked at a big firm, a small firm on Long Island, and then had my own business for a little bit. And then I started my firm with a college roommate. And I was like, okay, this is great, but I have no clients. So how am I going to get clients? And it occurred to me that if I work with you, the real estate agent community, pretty good referral source. And that has really proven itself out over 29 years. So I said, well, okay, how am I going to do that? And I approached Marianne Monteleone, who is on in the background. And Marianne was instrumental in helping me get certified to teach with New York State. And over the years, I taught your classes. I became the chair of your legal assistance committee, your common interest ownership committee. It has been an amazing relationship for me. I was fortunate enough, as Patrick said, 17 years ago to become broker counsel to REBNY. I answer their legal hotline every day. I publish 2 columns a week. And then I'm a transactional attorney. So I spend a lot of time representing purchasers and sellers and lenders. And it's great because it gives me kind of a unique perspective. I'm listening to you, the agent, every day. I'm teaching every day. but I'm also out there, I'm doing closings and so on. So love to talk about agency. I do teach fair housing for LIBOR, as well as the legal update class. Just one or two other things about me. Obviously, I'm certified to teach in New York. I'm an approved Arello instructor. I was appointed by the governor to serve on the New York State Real Estate Board a number of years ago. And I bring that up specifically because I have participated in drafting the fair housing regulations and the fair housing forms, the advertising regulations, and also the agency disclosure. So I actually drafted some of the language, some of the descriptions in the agency disclosure form. So I've kind of been here from the beginning, and I think it's important that I share that with you because I have some insight that I want to share with you. And as Patrick said, sometimes you need to go to the source. And I like to think that with respect to agency disclosure, I have a pretty good insight into how that works. So with that being said, before we jump into dual agency, I would love to share with you a couple of thoughts that I have, which will tie everything together. So first, I wanted to just talk a little bit about this concept of a systematic approach to the way you conduct your business. Once we talk about that, we're going to talk a little bit about the agency disclosure form, how to give the form, and then we'll circle back and we'll really do a deep dive into dual agency. So bear with me. I just want to lay some foundation for you because I think it's really important that we not only talk about dual agency, but we talk about the agency disclosure form, the way to deliver the form, and then we'll actually focus specifically on some really important concepts of dual agency. So with that being said, I talk about this every class. So if any of you out there have taken classes with me, you know that I talk about this concept of building a systematic approach to the way you conduct your business. And what I mean by that is that I think our business is perfectly suited to doing the same things over and over again. The deals change, the people change, the properties change, but the things that we do generally stay the same. And so I like the idea of building two types of checklists. One checklist is the non-negotiable things that we do in every transaction. The other type of checklist is deal specific. Obviously, if you're renting a single family home versus selling a co-op, they're very different. So I suggest you have templates that guide you through what you do in each of those transactions. With respect to the non-negotiable things, the things that we must do on every transaction, first thing on my checklist, non-negotiable is who am I representing? That's our agency question. It's the core of what we do every day. And as a result of that, it's question number one for me. So you always need to know who you're representing. Now, that may not always be the case. For example, in an open listing, you might be representing the landlord or the tenant. So you always need to identify who you're representing. If we ask question one, who we're representing, and we know that, then we can answer question two. Did I give the agency disclosure form? Which is obviously super important. We're going to talk about why that is, the role of the agency disclosure form. So we will talk about that. Just as an aside, a couple of other things that I have on my checklist. What are the fair housing laws in the place I'm conducting my business? If I gave the agency disclosure form, what other form do I have to give? The fair housing disclosure form. How am I getting paid? I want to make sure that I know how I'm getting paid in a transaction. If you go out of the LIBOR, one key environment, you go to REBNY, there's no guarantee of commission. You need to make sure that you have agreements. We've done cooperation agreements between REBNY and LIBOR members. And so you want to make sure that you ask the question, how am I getting paid? Now, what we do is we support those checklists with forms, agency disclosure form, for example, as well as templates, communication tools. So when you're giving the agency disclosure form, do you want to be typing an email every time you deliver that form? Or would you like to pull up your template, which you've worked on, you've amended over time, and you can easily send out that agency disclosure form? So that's my concept of building this systematic approach, doing the same things every time. It makes you professional, it makes you efficient, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to make you more money too. So I encourage you to do that. We're going to circle back to the idea of, hey, did you check this off? And you'll see how I bring this back around shortly. I'm the creator of something called the Toolbox for Real Estate Agents Success. I created it during the pandemic. And the Toolbox is exactly like it sounds. It is a resource for you, the real estate agent. I bring this up because as part of the Toolbox, we have something called the Checklist Builder, the Form section, and the Template section. You can build your checklist right now. You can start writing those things down that I just gave you on a piece of paper. But the Toolbox does give you the ability, it gives you the ability to build some checklists. So we have this checklist builder, and anyone is free to join the Toolbox. It has a pro membership, but I promise you that the checklist builder, the templates, the forms, they are always going to be free to anyone who would like to avail themselves of that. So I encourage you to sign up at the Toolbox again for that free membership. With respect to the checklist builder, you can go in, you can check off a box and pick the boxes you want on your checklist. You can email it to yourself, and then you have your checklist. And again, we also have the suggested templates, how to deliver an agency disclosure form, for example, and those forms that supported the agency disclosure form. So I encourage you to do that. I think it will make that systematic approach much easier. Okay, so now diving into agency and the agency law, where do we see it? Where does it say that you need to make this disclosure? And if you look at 175.7, New York Code's rules and regulations for real estate brokers, here is the language. Here is the interpretive language that the Department of State points to. A real estate broker shall make it clear for which party he or she is acting. Okay, so that's the language. That's the language that says, hey, you need to disclose how you're acting in a transaction. I want to point out for you commercial members, notice that there is no distinction between commercial and residential. Everyone needs to make this agency disclosure, regardless of the transaction that you're participating in. Now, what the law goes on to say, though, however, is in that in 1 to 4 family transactions and co-ops and condos, we're going to give you the form. So in the commercial setting, there is no standardized form in which you can make that agency disclosure. But we all know that when it comes to 1 to 4 family transactions, co-ops and condos, we have the agency disclosure form. Now, I want to throw out something to you. When I teach the agency class, usually there's a give and take here. Obviously, today, I'm just going to answer this question, but I think it's a really important question. What do you think the biggest complaint about you, the real estate agent, is? This is nationwide. What do you think when you ask a consumer, what is their biggest complaint about real estate agents? When asked this question, what has been found is that the consumer turns around and says, you know what? I don't understand how I'm being represented. I don't really understand agency. So this is not anecdotal. There have been surveys and so on, and the consumers are basically saying is, I don't really understand how I'm being represented. And that probably shouldn't be a surprise to you, right? You look at the concepts of sub-agency, buyer's agency, broker's agency, dual agency, open listings, and so on. And it should not be a surprise to you. A couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, my wife and I live on Long Island. We lived in Great Neck. We sold our house, and then we started looking for another property, which I love to do, by the way. I love to be out there, and we probably saw 30 properties. I will tell you that in my personal experience, very few agents that we dealt with really gave the agency disclosure form correctly. They didn't explain it correctly. They didn't understand the concepts. And so I think that's a problem. Now, I want to throw in another concept, or I want to throw out to you the idea, what do you think the biggest misconception about real estate agents is? One is a complaint, one's a misconception. Now, I get lots of comments when I ask this question, but I will tell you that I think the biggest misconception is that consumers think your job is easy, and they think that you make a lot of money for doing a little bit of work. Folks, that's a huge problem. And for me, it creates what I call an identity crisis. It creates an identity crisis because if you put those together, if you put the idea together that that the consumer doesn't understand agency and how they're being represented, and they don't think, they devalue what you do, that's a real problem. So what do we do about this? Well, I would suggest to you that using the agency disclosure form is your best form of marketing. Yes. What is the purpose of the form? It's consumer protection. That's why we drafted the form, so the consumer could understand how they're being represented. They could read the form, they can look at the form and see the different types of agency. So it's consumer protection, and the requirements that they be given the form, consumer protectionary. Folks, it's also agent protectionary. You have to comply with the law, so this gives you the ability to do that. Additionally, if you don't give the form, I promise you, and there's a complaint against you, you will be fined by the Department of State. Guarantee that. Additionally, undisclosed agency or undisclosed dual agency, I promise you, will result in a loss of commission. Now, I'm just throwing out, there's a case that March of 2022, I bring this case up not because it's in DC, but because of the amount of commission that was lost. Now, granted, this is not in New York, but the concept is the same, which is there was undisclosed dual agency. In this case, a commission of approximately $800,000 was lost due to undisclosed dual agency. So again, it protects you. Give that form. Make sure you disclose the agency relationship, the dual agency, which is what we're going to get into, because if you don't, I promise you, you are risking your commission. Now, I also led into this by saying it's the best form of marketing. Why do I say that? Well, if we go back to our identity crisis, in which I firmly believe that you do have, and I say that respectfully, I say to you that you need to be the type of agent that just doesn't say, hey, there's this agency disclosure form, there's these concepts, initial here, sign here. I'm telling you that you want to be the top 1% of the agents out there, you will take this form, you will study it, you will learn it, you will practice giving it. And if you do that and you deliver it the right way, it will express your professionalism. It will give you the ability to show that you really do know what you're doing. You do know how you can explain to someone your agency relationship and how it works and so on. And I truly believe that will give you a leg up in competing with your other agents and so on. And so Patrick alluded to this before, and I agree. There's lots of things going on right now. We're getting a lot of questions. And quite frankly, in some cases, we don't have a lot of answers. I don't know that anyone does. And Patrick and I were talking about this concept, though, of control what you can control. We can't control a bunch of the things that are going on right now. We'll see where they wind up. But what can you control? You can control your decision to be better at what you do, better at delivering this form, better explaining about who you are, and so on. And I really believe that. And I'm passionate about it. And I think you should be as well.
Neil, I just want to chime in on that if I can, just because
Sure,
I
of course.
had a very successful agent say the exact same thing to me, that I can't understand why people wouldn't want to use this as a tool. Not only is it required, but this makes me look more professional. This answers the questions. And if I can explain this to somebody, they latch on to every word that I'm saying thereafter. And it really, it's a benefit to you. So not only is it required, it's such a benefit. And that's why I think it's so important to understand it and make use of it, not just mechanically deliver it.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And I agree. What kind of confounds me sometimes, I teach this class, I've taught this class to thousands and thousands of people, Patrick, and for whatever reason, I don't know, they just don't want to do it. But then I get the pushback, oh, the form is too difficult, or it's too complex. And my response is, when was the last time you actually read the form? When was the last time you actually read the form? So we have 134 people in the room. Go read the form. Please go read the form. I promise you it will make a difference. And I completely agree with Patrick. So let's talk about some important concepts of agency. And again, we are leading to dual agency, I promise you. So we all know this. When we took our salesperson's class and so on, we have certain fiduciary obligations that go along with that agency relationship. idea of confidentiality, reasonable care, undivided loyalty, obedience, and so on. And so we're not going to do a deep dive. I underline undivided loyalty because it's going to be relevant when we talk about dual agency. But again, go take a look at the form. The form talks about this. It talks about what your obligations are, not only to the party you're representing, but to the opposing party, the other party in the transaction as well. Obviously, here is the form. And again, you can see it talks about, this is the landlord's form. We all know that there's a form for rental transactions and purchase transactions, but please go read the form. Take the time, understand it. Okay, a couple of important things about agency that I just want to get out. First thing, agency relationships are consensual. There needs to be a meeting of the minds. Similarly, just as I said before, you're never entitled to or guaranteed a commission. You need to have an agreement of commission. There should be a meeting of the minds as to the relationship, the agency relationship that you're creating. Next concept, compensation does not create agency. If you are representing a buyer and you are paid by the seller, that does not create an agency relationship. So the two are not joined together. You can be compensated by another party to the transaction that you're not representing, and that is perfectly fine. One broker concept. So let's all understand that there is, in theory, only one broker on your side of the transaction. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that we have ABC Realty Co. ABC Realty Co. has 100 agents. Let's say it has 500 agents. And let's say that I'm the principal of ABC Realty Co. So ABC Realty Co. is the broker, not me, Neil Garfinkel. Even if I qualify the company to be a brokerage, it's not the individual agents. ABC Realty Co. is the one broker. So as a result of that, at the closing, the check is cut to ABC Realty Co. It is not cut to Neil Garfinkel as the representative broker. It is cut to ABC Realty Co. ABC Realty Co. signs the brokerage agreements and so on. ABC Realty Co. has 500 agents. Each individual agent is associated with ABC Realty Co. But again, they're not the broker. The relationship between the buyer and the seller extends to and from a brokerage perspective to ABC Realty Co. So again, we're going to talk about this in the dual agency concept, that ABC Realty Co., when it's representing the buyer and the seller, that creates the dual agency. It's not the fact, for example, that one agent brings in a buyer, one agent brings in the seller. They are not the brokers. ABC Realty Co. is the broker. So filling out the agency disclosure form, actually, I believe very straightforward, very straightforward. If the purpose of the form is to let people know who you are, there's always going to be one box that you check on that form, and that's the type of agent that you are. Who am I representing? So you are always going to check off the type of agent that you are. If I am representing the seller, then I'm going to check off the box that says I am the seller's agent. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? I am the seller's agent. Now, let's say that I have the listing, I'm representing the seller, and Patrick comes to me as a buyer. Is not represented, doesn't want to be represented. I simply need to give him an agency disclosure form that says, hey, Patrick, I'm the seller's agent. And so whether I am giving the agency disclosure form to the seller and saying to the seller, hey, I'm going to be your agent, I'm the seller's agent, or I am meeting with other consumers, other buyers in connection with that relationship, same thing. I'm always checking off the type of agent that I am in that transaction. And so the idea is really straightforward. Check off the type of agent that you are. Okay. Now, when we are representing someone, so let's say we're representing, let's just use Patrick as our example. Patrick is our seller. Okay. So Patrick, thanks for giving me the opportunity to represent you, selling your property. Patrick, I want to let you know that I'm going to be your seller's agent. Okay, great. I need to get another box checked. What's the other box that I need to get checked? And it's this concept of advanced informed consent to dual agency. Why do we need to get that box checked? So when we are representing someone, whether it's Patrick selling or even Patrick buying, we need to get, when we're representing someone, representing their interests, we always need to get this concept of advanced informed consent to dual agency. Why do we need to do that? Okay, why do we need to do that? And the reason is pretty straightforward. It's from what it is because the way that business gets done in New York is that companies represent buyers and sellers, brokers represent buyers and sellers at the same time, not in the same transaction, but when I'm conducting business. So let's go back to ABC Realty Co. I'm representing lots of buyers and lots of sellers at the same time. And so because we have that one broker concept, even if we have one agent, one of my agents in one office bringing in the buyer and one agent in another office bringing in the seller, because of the one broker concept, the fact that ABC Realty Co. is the broker, then if you bring in those two parties, you bring the buyer and the seller together, that creates dual agency. So what we're talking about here is the possibility of dual agency. And this is really important. So when I say this to Patrick, hey, Patrick, I'm going to be your seller's agent, but I need to check off another box. I need to check off this advanced informed consent to dual agency. Dual agency is a situation where I'm representing you, the seller, Patrick, but there's a possibility, there is a chance that someone else at ABC Realty Co. is going to bring in a buyer. And as a result of that, if that happens, it creates dual agency. So we always want to get advanced informed consent to dual agency checked off because of the possibility. We're not saying to the consumer, we're not saying to Patrick, the seller, hey, it is definitely going to be created. What we're saying is, look, it could happen. And as a result of that, we need to check off those two boxes. Now, remember, the form is not a contract. It says it right at the top. It is a disclosure form. It discloses these relationships. And in this case, it is simply disclosing the possibility of that happening. So when for example, this would be an example of an agency disclosure form. We check off, we're representing the seller as the seller's agent, and we get that advanced informed consent to dual agency. Okay, so now really let's dive in. Okay, first question is dual agency legal? So the answer is dual agency is perfectly legal in New York, provided what? Provided that we make sure we give the disclosure and provided that we get an acknowledgement of the dual agency relationship when it's created. I will point out that dual agency is illegal in some states. Why? Well, I suppose that you could look at this idea of undivided loyalty. Remember, one of our fiduciary duties is undivided loyalty. That's not possible. I suppose that there could be potential conflicts of interest. So the idea is that in fact, there are some places that say we don't want you to dual agency. I assure you, in New York, that is not the case. And again, I go back to, I think that virtually many and most companies, they need to get dual agency because they are representing lots of landlords and tenants lots of buyers and sellers at the same time. And there is always that potential for crossover. Okay, so how should you talk about this, right? If we talk about the idea of good disclosure, good conversation, showing that you know what you're doing, how should you talk about the dual agency? Well, first thing, confidentiality. I would absolutely focus on this. If you are a dual agent, if the broker's a dual agent, even if you have those agents that are representing the buyer and the seller, you have an obligation of confidentiality. So what does that mean? It means that, so let's say that our seller was getting divorced. Let's say that we have a seller that's getting divorced. Would we ever, as a dual agent, disclose that to the buyer? The answer is no. We would never disclose our motivations and we'd never disclose our pricing. Let's assume that our buyer just won, $100 million in lotto. Would we say to the seller, hey, want to tell you that our buyer just won $100 million, money is no object? The answer is, of course not. So when we're talking about dual agency, we should focus on the concept that we are going to, even as a dual agent, maintain confidences. Now, what about disclosure of other information? I would say that you would do this carefully, right? You want to talk about things, you want to be an intermediary. You want to be a facilitator, but you don't want to take either side. Now, I underlined undivided loyalty before, and you do need to let the parties know that you can't offer one of those principles of agency, which is undivided loyalty. You can't be undivided to someone if you're representing both sides. So important that you mention, okay, I can't provide that undivided loyalty, but again, I can provide confidentiality. I will be very careful with respect to disclosure of information. I will serve as an intermediary and facilitator. Additionally, I will treat all parties honestly. I can provide information about the property. It's important that we financially qualify the buyer. Now, we're not talking about pricing. We're not setting a price. But we can certainly talk about the importance of the buyer qualifying. We can explain the purchasing and the leasing process. We can provide information regarding comparable properties, and we can also facilitate and participate in arranging those inspections or introducing financing opportunities, mortgage people, and so on. So those are the things that I would say that if you focus on this, you talk about this, it makes you that much more professional. Now, again, some of these things, this is something you need to practice, as we talked about. This is something that you need to work on because, again, it may not come naturally. And we're going to talk about how to deal with objections to dual agency in a little bit. I think it's important that we talk right now about the concept of designated agents. If you look at the form, if we go back to the form, you see that we have advanced informed consent to dual agency, or we have advanced informed consent to dual agency with designated agents. So what is a designated agent? A designated agent would be an agent at the firm, so ABC Realty Co., which is designated to represent one of the parties. And there are some firms that say, look, if we're going to do dual agency, we want to designate an agent to represent the party, to represent one of those parties in every situation. Why? Well, it gives the party, the buyer, the seller, a comfort level that they are being represented by a particular agent at the firm. And what can that agent do? Well, they could recommend pricing. They can advocate, and that's a key word. They can advocate on behalf of and in the best interest of the respective parties. They can negotiate on behalf of a seller, and this should say negotiate on behalf of a seller or a purchaser. They can make recommendations and so on. So it's kind of like having a mini agency relationship where you are representing the interests of one of the parties, and someone else at the firm is representing another interest. I kind of refer to it as, it's as if I was acting, for example, as a designated agent for the seller, I would treat the other agents in my firm as if they worked at another firm. So I would advocate and so on behalf of my agent. Now, remember that the dual agency is created at the broker level. It's not created at the agent level. So it's important that we do understand that you still can't provide that undivided loyalty, but you can advocate on behalf of those parties, the party that you're designated to represent. Very important point that I want to make is that we talk about direct deals and what happens in that deal. And I'm defining a direct deal as a situation where the seller's broker is obviously representing the seller, but does not represent the purchaser. Said a different way, purchaser comes to the transaction, purchaser is unrepresented, which is perfectly legal. There is nothing wrong with that. A purchaser does not need to be represented, nor, quite frankly, does any party. You could have a purchaser, you could have a seller that's unrepresented. You do not need to have an agent representing both of the parties' interests. But in a direct deal, and this is important, is that it doesn't create dual agency. It doesn't create dual agency when a purchaser comes to a seller and says, hey, I'm interested in making an offer and so on. The dual agency is not created. You need to have a meeting of the minds to create that dual agency. So I get a lot of confusion there where we have a seller we're representing a seller and someone comes, a purchaser comes unrepresented, you do not have to create dual agency. You can, but you do not have to. Now, just another point here, and I think this is really important, is that if you are representing the seller and you have an unrepresented purchaser, what should you do? Well, make sure that you give the agency disclosure form and check off which box, the one box. I am representing the seller, right? So you're going to always check off, I am representing the seller. I would then make sure that I talk about what are the appropriate guardrails, so to speak. What are my obligations to the seller versus what are my obligations to you as the purchaser? Remember that the agency disclosure form absolutely describes the idea that if I'm representing the seller, I have obligations to the buyer as well. I have an obligation to do my job with good skill and care. I have an obligation to be honest and fair, and I have an obligation to disclose any material fact that could affect the value or desirability of the property. Any fact known to me that could materially affect the value or desirability of the property, I have an obligation as a seller's broker, seller's agent, to disclose to the buyer. Finally, if I am doing a co-op or condo and I am representing a seller, the buyer is unrepresented, I would make sure that we talk about who's going to prepare that board package. That's very important because presumably I, as the seller's broker, I'm going to prepare that board package, but I want to make it clear to the buyer that I don't represent their interests. And how do you do this? Well, now going back to my checklists, right? If I'm doing a direct deal, I would have a checklist for direct deals. What do I do on direct deals? Well, I make sure that I gave the agency disclosure form appropriately. Maybe I have a template, an email that I send out to the buyer outlining what I do, how do I act in that transaction, and so on. I talk about the board package if appropriate. So again, our checklist items, so important. Now, what does the Department of State say about dual agency? I don't know if you know, but there is actually a memorandum that is out there that talks about dual agency, and it's titled, here's the title, Be Wary of Dual Agency. So this is the Department of State saying to a consumer, be wary of dual agency. And what does this memo say, this memorandum say? Well, it says that agents must clearly explain the existence of dual agency issue and its implications, that the agent must obtain a written acknowledgement from the parties regarding the dual agency. The parties must confirm that they understand that the dual agent will be working for both parties. Parties must confirm that they understand that they can engage their own agent to act for them. Parties must confirm that they understand that they're giving up their rights to undivided loyalty, and the parties must confirm that they have carefully considered the possible consequences of dual agency. So this is the Department of State saying, hey, when you have dual agency or the possibility of dual agency, you need to disclose these things. So my question to you is, are you doing this? And the answer is yes, if you give the agency disclosure form. If you give the agency disclosure form, you will see that in the conversation of dual agency, it addresses the things that are raised in that memorandum. So now the question becomes, and this is a really important question, is the delivery of the agency disclosure form enough? Is simply giving the form enough? And I think we have guidance in a case called Goldstein versus Houlihan Lawrence. Now, this case is important because, and it was brought a couple of years ago, it's important for the following reasons. Number one, the law firm that's bringing the case is a well-known national law firm. They're not just getting involved in some small matter because they think it's important. They're getting involved because they think there's money to be made here. Number two, this case is now a class action, meaning that it's not only the individual that's sued, it is now everyone that was, and I'll explain this in a minute, that was represented by Houlihan Lawrence as a dual agent. It's against Houlihan Lawrence, as I just indicated, and as the name indicates. That's important because Houlihan Lawrence is by volume one of the largest, if not the largest, broker in Westchester. And if this case is successful, I'm pretty sure that this firm is going to bring other cases based on dual agency. So what does this case talk about? Well, we have a woman named Mrs. Goldstein. Mrs. Goldstein is represented by an agent, let's just call it buyer's agent at Houlihan Lawrence. Houlihan Lawrence, the agent gives an agency disclosure form, discloses dual agency. Mrs. Goldstein is making an offer on a property. Ultimately, after a back and forth, the price that is agreed to is $35,000 over the asking price. Okay. Ultimately, Mrs. Goldstein finds out that while she was being represented by one agent, the buyer's agent at Houlihan Lawrence, the buyer's agent is on a team with the selling agent, the agent that brought in the seller. And that agent that brought in the seller is the team lead of the team that the buyer's agent is on. And it turns out that they're brother-in-laws. So the buyer's agent and the seller's agent are brothers-in-law. Now, I don't know about you folks. I don't even know if it's legally you're required to disclose that, but I'm pretty sure that if I was involved in a transaction that I was doing with my brother-in-law, and it was in these circumstances, I would disclose that, okay? So Mrs. Goldstein brings this case, and she says, look, Houlihan Lawrence is using dual agency as a tool to trick people and a tool to make more money and so on. Now, the case has not been decided. As I said before, it has been converted to a class action, meaning it's not only Mrs. Goldstein, but it is every buyer and seller that was represented by Houlihan Lawrence as a dual agent. So there's a lot of, right, that's probably a lot of people. Okay. We can't undo what has been done, but we can listen to what the judge has said so far. The judge has issued certain opinions based on what's called motion practice. And what the judge has said is that it is not enough. It is not enough to simply give the agency disclosure form. The agent, the dual agent must explain carefully to the buyer and seller how they're acting and so on. And the judge actually looks at the language in the agency disclosure form, in the agency law piece, where it basically says, look, it's not enough to just give the form. You need to disclose that. You need to disclose that. You need to talk about it. So what are our important takeaways from this case so far? It is not enough just to give the agency disclosure form. You have to explain it. Now, how do we do that? How do we explain it? How do we show that we explained it? Well, again, I go back to now our email template. I go back to my checklist, which is, okay, did I give the agency disclosure form? Did I deliver the agency disclosure form as part of my email template where I talk about this, where I confirm, hey, remember we talked about this? These are the things that you should take a look at, particularly notice the dual agency and so on. The other important piece is, remember we talked about at the beginning the idea that we were saying to Patrick, the seller, there's a possibility of dual agency, right? We didn't know when we gave that agency disclosure form if in fact there was going to be dual agency. Now, if the dual agency is created, we need to go back to Patrick and say, hey, Patrick, I want to remind you, I want to let you know that the dual agency was created. And at that point, Patrick could say, you know what, I'm not really happy about that. Okay, so it's not enough to give the agency disclosure form, simply saying, here's an agency disclosure form, you need to explain it. Okay. So again, use our checklist. Circling back to what I started about, create that checklist. Who do I represent? Did I give the agency disclosure form? Did I use my email template explaining agency disclosure? So that would be one checklist item. The second piece, if I have dual agency, then did I disclose the dual agency? Did I have the parties acknowledge the dual agency? Good news, LIBOR has a template. And it's used, it can be used as an additional supplement to the agency disclosure form. One focuses on advanced informed consent to dual agency. Another focuses on advanced informed consent to dual agency with designated sales agents. Use those templates. If you, they are extensive, so maybe you want to cut them down a little bit. I'm not going to give you advice one way or the other. But the good news is that you do have these templates, which are actually very, very detailed. I believe if you use these templates, if you follow these checklist items, you will do what you need to do. You won't find yourself in a situation where you're risking your commission, as we talked about, or risking your license and so on. You want to make sure that you've used your checklists. So I just want to do real quickly. I'm not a real estate agent. So I'm not doing deals like you, but if I was meeting with a seller, I just want to kind of go through, we talk, I used Patrick before, so I'm going to expand on that a little bit. And this is how I would do it. I would say, hey, Patrick, thanks again for giving me the opportunity to meet with you. Really appreciate that. As you know, my firm, ABC Realty Co., we've been around 29 years, and we're really excited to represent you. We're really excited to represent you selling your house. So thank you for having that trust in us. Now, to be clear, you want us to sell your house. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it really in two ways. In one way, we're going to put your property on the MLS. We're going to put it on what's something called One Key. And One Key is owned by the Long Island Board of Realtors, as well as other trade associations. And the point is that One Key has thousands and thousands of members and thousands of listings. The idea is that we want to expose your property to as many people as possible. And the way that we do that, again, is by putting it in front of as many people as possible. So what is that going to tell us? It's going to really tell us two things. Did we price this property correctly? We might have to raise the price, might have to lower the price. And also, what kind of condition is the property in? Because when I'm working with other One Key members, they're going to share with me, they're going to give me an idea, okay, what is this property? What is the best way to sell this property? And so on. Now, there's another way. I have, as I may have mentioned, I have about 500 agents that work with me. Those agents are hungry, and they are going to be running around, and they are going to be looking for a buyer for your property as well. And the way that they're going to do that is, again, actively market. It raises an interesting point, though, a point that I want to talk to you about, which is if one of my agents is able to find a buyer for your property, it's going to create something called dual agency. Dual agency is very, very simply and straightforward the idea that ABC Realty Co. is representing you, the seller, and the buyer at the same time. Because ABC Realty Co., regardless of its 500 agents, there's only one broker, that's ABC Realty Co. And so I wanted to alert you to this. Now, I'm not telling you that it is in fact going to be created. I'm telling you that it could be created. So, Patrick, there's this New York State agency disclosure form that I'd like to give to you. I'd like for you to take a look at and read it. You'll notice that it talks about seller's agent, which is what I am. I'm going to be your seller's agent. It also talks about that dual agency relationship that could be created. And so, Patrick, I need you to check off two boxes today. One is the seller's agent's box. The other is the advanced informed consent to dual agency. Patrick, what you're doing there is you're saying to me, look, there is a possibility that one of the agents at ABC Realty Co. is going to find a buyer. Now, if that's the case, I need to come back to you. I will let you know that, and you always have the right to say, you know what, I don't want to go forward with that. So, folks, that's kind of how I would do that listing presentation. Now, it's very possible that Patrick says, oh, that's great, terrific, well, let's move forward. It's also possible that Patrick would say, you know what, I'm not really comfortable with this. And I don't really like the idea. I came to you to sell my property, and now you're telling me you're going to be something called a dual agent. You're telling me that, in fact, you're going to be representing both sides. How does that make any sense? And so how do we deal with those objections? Well, the first thing is that we would say is, look, I'm not telling you it's going to be created. I'm telling you that it might be created. You're giving me flexibility to potentially show your property to purchasers that we're currently working with. If you don't give me that flexibility, I am not going to be able to work with any of those purchasers. And quite frankly, I have a lot of agents. It is going to be very difficult. So you're talking about the possibility. Now, I want to remind you that if dual agency is created, I need to come back to you and I need to get that acknowledgement. Now, folks, let's be honest. If we bring Patrick a buyer and it's a good buyer, Patrick is probably not going to care much about this, right? He's probably not going to care much about it. But let's say he says, I'm still not comfortable. Okay, what do we do then? Then we can talk about designated agents. Now, I'm not saying you could talk about designated agents right from the beginning. I have no problem with that. But assume that we had not. Now we could talk about the idea and say, hey, Patrick, I can be designated as your agent. I can advocate for you. I can look after you at my firm and at my brokerage, and I'm going to treat everyone else at my firm as if they worked at another firm. Now, suppose Patrick still says, I don't love that idea. I don't love that idea. What do you do then? And I don't want you to lead with this, but I think that you need to, at that point, say, look, this is the way business gets done in New York. What do I mean by that? If you go next door to another firm, let's say they have 100 agents, they still need to do the same thing that I'm doing. If they are giving the agency disclosure form in an appropriate and a proper way, they are going to need to tell you about the possibility of of dual agency. They're going to need to get that from you. So you came to me because you trusted me, you wanted me to represent you. And I'm telling you that I promise you that I'm going to do all of these things. But if you go next door because you don't like the dual agency, unless they're lying to you or unless they have a very different business model, they're going to need to do the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen at the moment, and I'm going to look to see. I believe that there are some.
I think, Neil, there was one question about, could you maybe explain how to present the agency disclosure form to a buyer? I think you've given some examples about sellers, but there was a question about how you go about that with a buyer.
Yeah, so really the same thing, folks, really the same thing, which is I'm letting you know first and foremost that I'm a buyer's agent. I'm going to be your buyer's agent. Okay, now, again, depending on the relationships, there's a very good chance that even if that buyer's agent is working at a smaller shop, even if it's a smaller shop, they're also working with sellers. So I would do the exact same thing. I would get both boxes checked. I'm your buyer's agent. But if I bring you to a listing that my firm has, then we create that dual agency. The Department of State has said that you can annotate the agency disclosure form. You can't change it, but you can annotate it. I might, on a buyer's agency form, I might put next to buyer's agency something to the effect of when I show you other firms' properties, and then next to advanced informed consent to dual agency when I show you my firm's listings. But really, same concepts, same discussion, just checking off different boxes.
I think there was also some questions at the beginning where people could find the toolbox that you were referring to.
So I'm going to type that into the, I'm going to type it into the chat box. I think I can do that. And I'm just going to type in my information as well, Patrick, while we're wrapping up. So my email and my phone number, and everyone can certainly feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer any other questions that anyone has. Love these presentations, love the opportunity to talk to LIBOR and LIBOR's members. This is where I started my career. I owe significant debt of gratitude to you, the LIBOR community. So thank you for always giving me the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Great, thanks. I see one other question that just popped up. If you have a second, it was in the Q&A about I'm reading it at the same time. Someone's saying I'm not working with a buyer as a buyer's agent. Then if I show that buyer my listing or my company's listing, that is not dual agency. Dual agency only exists if I have already signed the buyer as a buyer's agent, correct?
Right. So Michael, so you got to kind of take a step back and go to my checklist. Like, who am I representing? So let's say your firm is representing the seller and a buyer comes to you and says, Michael, I don't want to be represented. So I don't want to be represented. Buyer does not have to be represented. Your broker is representing the seller. And that buyer could be unrepresented, and there is no dual agency there. You need to give that agency disclosure form. I would go through the checklist of the items that I do. It does not create that. Now, it's an important issue, right? Because then people get confused a little bit, which is the concept of, I talked about compensation does not create agency. Also, New York State law and Department of State don't talk about compensation in terms of how it works in your firm, meaning that, so let's say that buyer comes to you, does not want to be represented. Michael, how you're going to be compensated by your firm in connection with that is really up to you and your firm, right? So the idea of, we don't care about, the Department of State, New York doesn't care about how you divvy up the monies as it relates to who's representing who. That's up to you folks to figure out, right? And I make that point because when you're a designated agent, for example, if you're a designated agent, you can only represent the seller. Let's say you bring it in, but suppose you bring in the buyer as well. But now another agent at your firm is going to have to act as a designated agent for the buyer. Well, New York State doesn't really care about the fact that you might lose or have to share a portion of your commission with someone else. So I just want to be clear. I mean, I think it's important questions to ask, but as it relates to agency disclosure and how those things relate to your compensation vis-a-vis your firm and other agents, that's up to you to decide. Does that make sense, Patrick?
I think it does. Yes. Thank you. All right. I think we're at the hour. So I think that we will call it quits. Thank you, Neil. This was great. Extremely informative. Again, if anybody missed this in your office and you'd like them to see it, this will be up on the website. And also just to let everybody know before you leave, we do have another Wednesday webinar coming up next week on buyer representation agreements with Roseanne Farrow. So if you're interested in learning about that, and I suggest that everybody learn more about that topic, please tune in next Wednesday for that webinar as well.
Thanks, Patrick. See everyone soon.
Thank you again.